Everybody, welcome back to the Insiders Lounge. Today we have another special episode and another special guest. Rob, before we get into things here, just looking over your LinkedIn or your resume, we've got Sky, we've got talkSPORT, we've got Man City. There's a lot of big names, big brands, but I want to walk through, I would say, the journey getting there. I know there's always a starting point, which we'll get into just after this, but the journey, what do people need to know about you in order to understand how you work today and just how you are as a human being?
Yeah, and first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So I think for me, look, sport has always been a passion point. It's always been the centerpiece of everything that I've done within my life and my career and my hobbies. So within a working capacity, I always try to find a sporting angle wherever possible. That started off from the university course that I took that had a kind of sporting angle to it. The first job that I kind of managed to get outside of that. And then even working in more traditional media partnerships and media sales, I'd always try and find a sports angle. So I worked in publishing at a newspaper. I got friendly with the sports desk and kind of took it upon myself to create sponsorship packages for major sporting events, just as a starting point, because ultimately, if you're passionate about something, it feels like you're not working. So I'd always try and find in that scenario for someone else listening, find that way of building your passion into your day to day, because it will separate you, because ultimately you're going to put more effort into that if something you really love and really believe in, and people notice. And that led to me, thankfully, finding opportunities where sport was more the primary than the secondary part of the role. And then again, it's just something that you're happy to wake up every day and go out and do.
Yeah, we always end up jumping into the questions. So first of all, appreciate you having you on. I appreciate the time and everything. But we spoke about kind of the breaking in point, that kind of foot in the door. Like I mentioned before the actual recording, this is something we used to kind of break down more in depth in earlier episodes on the podcast. But I think it's something we've kind of gone away from. But I think it's important, especially for people that are at that stage. I think it's kind of the unknown. It's like no one really knows how to sometimes take that first step. And I think listening to people and hearing, okay, this is how I went through the process. This is how I got to where I am today. I think that's powerful for a younger listener. So I would love to hear from your side. I know you said it was a little bit of a unique angle. I'd love to hear kind of how you first broke into the sporting industry, but I would say just a career in general.
So the first job that I ever had was working in a local sporting goods store here in London. So kind of northeast London. And what was interesting about it was a really traditional sports equipment outfitters rather than more of a leisure wear and clothing. They did equipment, they did playing kit, and in particular, they were very well known for football boots or soccer cleats. So what's interesting about it, it was the shop where David Beckham bought his first ever pair of boots.
Oh, wow.
So 1 year after I'd left, but 1 year I knew the guys that still worked there, Adidas came in with the first pair off the line of the new Predators, and they did the PR launch there. And what was interesting to me was I was always fascinated by the business side of sports, even as a kid. So seeing just the behind the scenes of the kind of merchandise and retail side of things. So we had a great situation where West Ham United used to come and buy all of the boots for all of the non-sponsored players. They would come every year, every summer. The kit man would come in and he just needed about 50 pairs, and they were either Adidas World Cups or Copa Mundials for hard or soft ground, or Puma Kings. And it would just be, right, I need 6 pairs of 7s, 8 pairs of 9s. And you go back to the back of the warehouse and you'd come out with all these things, and not realizing that was ultimately, like, these clubs are businesses and they provide the tools for their staff to be successful. So that was an interesting kind of starting point for me, was knowing and understanding a bit about how that sports industry worked to a certain extent. And then coming out of university, I managed to get a role at a sports apparel company that were the UK licensee to a number of brands, which included Converse, but actually before Nike took them over. And so also they had Le Coq Sportif, which is a big French brand, but at the time were producing the playing kits for a number of Premier League football clubs. So we did the kits for Wolves, QPR and Crystal Palace, off the top of my head, were the teams in kind of the early 2000s that, again, they were supplying the kits to, and again, it was a bit of an eye opener into actually it's not the big global brand that's kind of doing the deal with these clubs. There are local people on the ground that are doing individual businesses in those kind of spaces. So again, an interesting kind of eye opener into what that world and landscape looked like. But that wasn't really the kind of jet setting, cool young 20 somethings in central London. This was in an industrial estate an hour outside of London. And thankfully, a friend of mine was working in a media agency at that point, gave me a call saying, there's some jobs going here in our TV department. You basically get to watch TV all day and get taken out for lunch. And I thought that sounds right up my street. And that kind of got me into this media environment that I've been in really with a sporting nod for the last 20 or so years.
And when you discuss the intersection of like business and sport, I would say football though, especially for you, where do you like, if you look back at your childhood, do you see connection points? Like I always like looking back at myself and go like, yeah, like I was really obsessed for myself in my generation. It was like career mode on FIFA. Like we would play that, but that was the way of like, okay, understanding how business works, how transaction and transfers go. Like that was kind of the start of it. I'm sure there's something for you. Did you have the same?
I was fascinated by brands. And so to the point where, and again, I'm talking, unfortunately, I'm a lot older than you. So kind of, early 90s, I could tell you, if you name me a Premier League player, I could tell you what brand he was sponsored by. Wow. I just kind of was into those kind of things. And it was news at the time when a big player moved to a different brand. And you're obsessed by then, when you had particularly Nike maybe coming into the space in the mid-90s, and then what they would do from a marketing point of view to make noise. That was for me the kind of thing I thought I want to do that. Unfortunately, I knew that my chances at playing professionally were slim to none. So being part of that kind of business side was always for me the area that I wanted to be in. And that was the kind of first place where I kind of thought I was interested in brands, in kits, in boots, in all those kind of areas. So again, working in the store and then looking at seeing kind of to a certain extent how the sausage is made, kind of really fanned the flames of what I wanted to do as I got a bit older.
Yeah, it's always fascinating looking back. I think it's you get to reminisce on it a little bit. Before we get into the Man City side of things, I think let's touch on Sky and talkSPORT. Just some of the key points from each one, like what your role looked at and kind of how that set you up for your time at City. Because I would say that was the kind of big the bigger block of your career was spent at City Football Group.
So both of those roles came at an interesting time when the media landscape was changing and digital media and digital activations were starting to become a thing, but still not really seen as mainstream. We're talking early 2010s. So I joined Sky, I think it was 2011. And so at that point, one of the biggest challenges really was in changing the cultural perception of what digital activations could be. And that traditionally they were seen as an add-on, a bit of a throw-in. I think before I joined Sky, the kind of Sky digital media team was a completely separate company. The year before, there was a wall in between the two organizations. They didn't talk to each other. There was no collaboration. And so a big part of the role and remit there, alongside ultimately delivering partnerships, and that was the remit there for me personally at Sky, was heading up digital partnerships. But the biggest part of that process was around educating the TV and the broadcast sponsorship team on how we could start to think more concept first, platform second. Not worry about here's an idea around a TV sponsorship and then can you add in some digital, but actually let's think about this in a bit more detail. So we ended up creating their first ever short form digital content partnerships, where traditionally digital had always really been used to drive people to tune into broadcast. This was the other way, where broadcast was driving people into a digital landscape, and we were creating short form video content, utilizing the talent and the kind of brand values of certain programs and certain shows to suit the needs of a brand and their brief. It was the first time they'd done anything like that at that point. And again, it took a lot of work internally to get people to move out of their comfort zone and look into these new spaces and work with maybe outside agencies at that point as well in that creative process.
You mentioned, I that's why I was jotting down a note there. You mentioned kind of digital being this almost add-on, like this kind of afterthought in the 2010s. Is there something, I know we're going to break down some of these terms and things later on, but is there something now where you see that as the add-on in these packages in today's time. So the digital equivalent in the 2010s, but today. So like I was thinking just off the bat, maybe Web3. Web3 is kind of just added on in these partnerships where it's like, hey, we want to say we're working in that space just to have it out there in case something comes out of it, but we're not really putting time or attention or money to it. I'm curious for you if there's any tie-ons to that you see.
Yeah, it feels like there's certain buzzwords that just get thrown in because I think, and without getting too much onto a high horse, I still struggle with a lack of digitally native resource being within major rights holders, particularly football clubs. A lot of the commercial teams are filled with people that have a huge amount of experience on the commercial side of sport. But the challenge is the sell should have changed. The requirements for brands has changed a lot over the last 10, 15 years. The sell hasn't changed that much. And all that's happened really over kind of 5, 10-year blocks is those buzzwords have changed. Whereas, in 2015, the kind of add-on would have been you get 5 Facebook posts a year as part of that, with no context around what that may be. They're just throwing that as a random number in. Now it's probably more like you get to own a content strand. And that's it. Again, without any understanding of volume, of quality, of relevance and viability. And I think that's one of the big challenges is the lack of collaboration between commercial and digital departments, be that content teams, social media management, digital product guys. In too many organizations, there's a lack of communication. They don't really know what the other one does. And ultimately, it leads to salespeople selling stuff that they don't really know, and then an activation or a content person having to just deal with it or kind of receive this hospital pass and make the best of it.
Yeah, I think we'll break that down, all the trends and kind of what we're working on in a little bit. But getting into Man City, it was cool when I saw, I was trying to kind of align your time at Man City and see how the squad was, what we were looking at. So you're joining in. It's kind of the start of KDB, the end of Vincent Kompany. The real, I would say, one of the first turning points. You had kind of the Aguero and Balotelli goal. That was, I think, one of the first memories, at least for me, of like, okay, this is kind of the new age of Man City. And I would love to hear from the commercial side when you joined what that looked like, because I think now if you look at Man City on the field, I think maybe not this season, but last season, and the seasons before, one of the best teams in the world, if not the best. And then on the commercial side, it's really following that. You're seeing them as one of the biggest brands in football now. So let's go back to your time first joining them. What was the kind of overall environment like within the City group, but also just in general in that space? And Absolutely. Then we'll kind of dive into your time more there.
Absolutely. So I joined City in 2015. So it would have been the last year of Manuel Pellegrini, and then going into the first kind of 3-4 years of the Pep Guardiola era. So all of their on-field successes, obviously, down to myself. But so
it was a perfect signing off the field.
Absolutely, I can motivate from a distance. But when I joined at an interesting time because, as you rightly said, the team had their investment from the Abu Dhabi group in late 2008, 2009. They started to have some real success on the field. And commercially, they realised that they really needed to act slightly differently to their peers, who in their mind wasn't just Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal, but actually it's Barcelona, Real Madrid, Dallas Cowboys, Lakers, Disney, Netflix, whoever. It's everyone. And so the challenge they had was that at that point, their fan numbers just didn't stack up against everyone else. Yeah, and you could argue kind of the validity of any of the numbers that anyone kind of put out in those days or even now. But even so, they knew they had to be different, and they really majored on creativity, innovation, and digital media at the heart of that. And at that point, you had teams like Liverpool and Manchester United had linear TV channels, and City consciously took the decision to go down a digital route that they thought would be younger and help them to build a fan base over time. They were the first team to really invest into YouTube as a content output and a platform that would work for them both from an engagement and a fan growth, but also from a commercial point of view. And then they were the first team to really invest in a broader social media output as a result of that. And when I came in, they created this department that they classed as commercial media. And that had 3 key functions, really, where you had strategy, so really insight and kind of evolving kind of trends within that space. that lent a bit more on the content production and strategy side. They had commercial, which is where I sat more than anything, which would be around how do we take those learnings and put that into partnership opportunities, and I can touch on that in a bit more detail.
Yeah.
And then we had digital ad operations, because at the time we were one of the first teams to really have a proper website with a proper ad server that had audience targeting and an ability to use that as a relevant commercial entity. So they were the first club to really recognize that, okay, we have a big audience digitally. If we're going to act like a publisher, then we need to have people with publishing experience. So they had a team of people that ranged from either media agency or media sales and partnership side to really revolutionize that space. And so my remit personally was on the commercial side, and 50% of that role would be working hand in hand with the partnerships team on developing assets, tools, processes, ultimately leading a lot of times the pitch process from ideation through to delivery and pitching to the client, and then delivering the solutions off the back of that. So that kind of revenue generator of finding new assets and new ways to grow the value of those partnerships. But I also had direct revenue responsibilities for areas like broadcast rights, where we still had them, licensing and IP sales, content syndication, and frankly, any other ideas I could have around how do we bring money into the business. And again, the biggest part, as I want to touch upon earlier, for me, actually, the biggest kind of success story we had was in bridging that gap between departments, because I'd had experience on both sides of the commercial and editorial, or commercial and product conversation. You're able to understand the dotted line between those two areas and where that moves and where you can poke and prod it to ultimately deliver great creative activations or ideas, but ones that were viable, that everyone was bought into, rather than one person isolated has this great idea and someone else has no idea where it's come from or what they've got to do with it. So that joining and that bridging, that soft skill almost, I think was the biggest strength of what they've done. And that department has grown and grown now over the last few years as a result.
And your role there, what did that look like first coming on board? Did they reach out to you? Were you reaching out to them? I'm curious the kind of story behind that.
I was fortunate that a former client of mine from a media agency was running the department. And so we had a previous history, and they were looking for people with media partnership experience, which is obviously what I had, and particularly in the sports space. And so, yeah, had an interesting. I remember, unfortunately, I turned up for my final interview with the then. I'm trying to think what his job title would have been. It would have been like VP of Media, and it was at 5 p.m. and someone put me in the conference room to wait for him, but no one told him that I was there. And so I sat on my own for an hour in the conference room thinking that either I'm being punked or there's a hidden camera and this is part of the kind of process. I don't know. And eventually had to sheepishly kind of make my way into the office floor looking for him. And thankfully, that when we did actually talk,
everything worked out.
It all worked out in the end, but it was all a very strange initial experience.
So let's get into, I was always fascinated, especially reading through some of the points that you had on LinkedIn and so on. One of your key drivers, like you mentioned, was just bringing in revenue through the commercial stream. Can we kind of break down, like if we break down in a pie chart or different percentages of where revenue came from? And then I think saying the idea of like, oh yeah, we brought revenue through media, I think can be kind of confusing to someone that doesn't really understand the space. So if you can break down what that actually looks like when we're talking about broadcast rights, when we're talking about IP, the social media side of things, ads, all of those different plays, I'd love to hear like what that actually played out to look like.
So there's a number of different ways, thankfully, that we were kind of looking to create revenue, or at least create those value opportunities. Because ultimately, from a sales point of view, I wasn't directly responsible for the sales, right? You are creating the opportunities. You're kind of arming the sales guys with all the tools they need to be successful. Ultimately, you are creating a number of avenues. So from a content point of view, for example, there's two ways ultimately that you're monetizing those content solutions. One is through brand partnerships, so either sponsored editorial or creating bespoke branded content. But obviously the other way is just through generating advertising revenue off of the social media platforms or off of your own and operating spaces through pre-roll and mid-roll advertising. We were able to really ram home to the guys internally that it's a great opportunity to generate interesting cash opportunities, because at that point, so many teams hadn't turned on monetization on their social platforms. And
Wow.
so, once you'd convinced the marketeers in the building that it wasn't going to have an impact on the viewership and the engagement numbers, which it didn't, because obviously there is a very specific line between advertising and content, or advertising and sponsorship. And that message took, it probably took a year or two to really get through to the powers that be that we need to embrace advertising, and it isn't going to undermine our sponsorship or partnership model. This is very much additive. So those elements starting to become more and more popular. And then you can just start reinvesting, because ultimately the more money you're making out of YouTube, for example, the more money you can invest into production staff, creators that are going to generate more content, that's going to get more views, that's going to generate more ad revenue. So that,
And was that a focus? Like, were they trying to just bring in revenue and take it as a profit, or were they constantly reinvesting it?
bit of both,
A bit
if
of
I'm
both, yeah.
honest. Ultimately, yes, we had revenue targets to hit. And once they started to happen, those targets grew very quickly. But I obviously I'm not in the building at the moment, but I would estimate that they're making a decent amount of money now out of their social media advertising revenue that very much pays for the 50 or so employees that are now part of that kind of production crew. So it can become quite a valuable and profitable entity, I think, quite quickly in those spaces. Um, on top of that, we were dealing with digital licensing and IP sales. So that would be, at that point, you're talking about branded products in, for example, the mobile phone space. So that's branded apps, that's brand integration into games, or creating your own bespoke games. There were mobile phone keyboards and backgrounds and all those kind of things that were big in the mid 2010s. But then more and more it would get into more things like content syndication and content partnerships. At one point, we did a partnership deal with the Players Tribune around this notion of co-creating, co-distributing, co-selling a kind of sponsored proposition together. And so those kind of elements of, again, looking at knowing we have an audience, more importantly, we have a product and access that we can provide to media partners that's of real value to them, that could be unique. How do we create a financial model that's going to work well, that can, prove valuable for us, and again, create, even more so nowadays with the PSR rules and the need to create these other revenue streams that could be invested back into the playing side, that these kind of models can be really kind of profitable for clubs.
So you first joined them in 2015, you said, right?
Yes.
And then it was like 6 or 7 years that you were there?
I left, it was just over 4 years. I left right at the start of 2020. Okay. So, yeah, it was still the, glory years on the field, obviously, absolutely.
Yeah, because what I'm trying to think now is, like, if we can go into the transition of what your, not necessarily what your role looked like, but those revenue levers, I guess you could say. So at the beginning, what were kind of like the top three where you would say this was bringing in the most amount of revenue? And then within your time there, like, let's say the 4 years, did those transition? Like, did they switch spots at all? And then I'm curious to now, like, obviously you're not in the day-to-day now, but I'm sure you can kind of get an idea of where their biggest revenue streams are.
Well, one thing that we definitely did, and it took a couple of years for the penny to drop, was really unlock the potential around sponsored editorial content. So traditionally, most people, when they thought about brand partners, it was just about bespoke branded content. It was footballers kicking balls at product X, or playing FIFA whilst talking about product X. Now, thankfully, we had a bit more creativity and innovation around our branded content solution. But I did a project and realized that based on the existing editorial content that was going out on social platforms, if we put a kind of evaluation model going into what an equivalent sponsorship would look like across all those things, I figured out quite quickly that we were sitting on $4, $5, $6 million a year of potential revenue if we were to have it all sponsored. Mm. And so we really started to think about how can we credibly integrate brands into the regular narrative of the club in a way that still drives value, rather than just being logo slapping and basic exposure. How can we create stories that suit the brand messaging of our partner, that's going to be worth infinitely more than just the random exposure you'd get from having an unconnected brand inserted into an unconnected piece of content. And so we did a lot of work, particularly around re-editing match highlights to suit a particular narrative. An example would be we created a piece called the Midfield Engine, which was looking at midfield play that was sponsored by Valvoline engine oils.
Yeah, that's so clever.
And we had the other one that was the watertight defense for Xylem, their water filtration partner. It's not rocket science, but it's
it works.
Looking at how can you maximize your existing assets to create value for your partners. But then also on the other side, you're creating more volume in your inventory that's going out on those social platforms that you could be getting that pre-roll and mid-roll advertising out of as well. And then you start looking at archive content as well, and simple things like, again, in the social space, it's just the volume is the real driver on this. So pieces like on this day, goal of the day, or you're playing whatever team, if we're playing Man United at the weekend, here's the top 5 goals from the last 10 years against that team. It's all content that the fan, the user, is interested in. On-field content is still your most valuable stuff. And you're just taking that ordinarily you'd just be sitting on otherwise and reworking it in a way where you know that you could find relative conversations that click with a brand, whether it's around strength, power, speed, heritage, passion, celebrations, all of these kind of brand marketing messages that can fit in quite easily with just a title and a rough narrative of that content piece. So that was the real area that started to then take off somewhat. And then you start looking at how does that then lead itself into the wider kind of partnership space, because then quite quickly you're able to arm the sales guys with assets that they understand quite easily, they can value quite easily, that becomes part of a partnership sell that is probably still going to be more effective than maybe what our competition were offering at that point.
Yeah, I think the importance of finding a match between the partner or the brand and the type of content is so key. Like I saw a series not too long ago on player arrivals, and that being on socials, and some teams just have the most random brand sponsoring that, and there's just no relevance to it. Then you'll see others that are sponsored by Chevrolet or a clothing brand, and the player is actually wearing the clothing brand or driving in a Chevy car. And it's like, okay, as the consumer, you relate to that post more. He's like, okay, this lines up. Like I'm seeing a Chevy logo and I'm seeing the car and the player is arriving. And I think there's just more of an emotional connection to that, where if you're just having a random brand slapped on just any social post, it just gets lost, in my opinion.
I think you can have the random brands involved if it's done in a way that makes sense. And what I mean by that is too often partnerships are sold by asset rather than by narrative and story. So instead of it being the front of shirt partner, if it was a principal partner, or in this example, like a match day partner, if you're ensuring that that partner then is around all of your match day content, or at least your match day story around that, then there's a relevance to them being part of that, what may seem unconnected piece of content. So I'd always strive to try and find those narratives that fit together rather than selling piecemeal asset by asset.
So you've given us quite a few sponsorships and different partnerships. I would love to hear maybe a top 3 or a top 2 that were just the favorite to work on and that you thought were the most value driven and from your side and from the brand side.
There's one example that really comes to mind that wasn't a traditional sponsorship. So I said one of the areas that I was responsible for was broadcast rights. And 2017, I'm going to say, our women's team had just qualified for the UEFA Champions League for the first time. And at that point, UEFA only kept the rights to the final. So the teams had the rights to sell the broadcast to every game up to the final, your home games.
Oh, interesting.
To the final.
Yeah.
And so I went to market to try and sell these games, and went to all of the local and regional broadcasters, and no one was really interested, or no one was willing to put any money into it. And at that point, we had just invested quite a lot in our in-house production facilities. And at the time as well, Facebook Live was really taking off. It was a product that Facebook were really putting, their own muscle behind. Mm-hmm. And so I realized quite quickly that actually, instead of going and having this as a traditional broadcast, why don't we self-produce this and self-distribute it and create it as a sponsored asset and activation? And so we got the approval internally to, put the resource required and get an outside broadcast unit. And and do it as a real kind of professional operation. We marketed the hell out of it, and we managed to bring one of our partners, Nissan, on board to really kind of power the whole thing. And again, because it was our own broadcast, it meant that we could be a lot more open to how we were going to integrate them as a brand. So not only were they across a whole host of on-screen graphics, but there was a player of the game that they were sponsoring. There was as well all of the clips that were going out. We were able to live clip using products like Grabio at the time that were going onto other social platforms that they were integrating into, and all of the other social content that we were going to produce around it. So we ended up tying them up with a deal that was offering 3 or 4x what we were getting offered from broadcasters at the point for just the first game. And they loved it so much that they ended up committing to the next 2 years of games in that kind of space. So for me, it was a great example of just looking at how we can be creative and innovative in this scenario, not worrying about the way things have always been done, but actually what can we do and how can we make the best of it? And, I would always lean into the sponsorship side. It's always the conversation I have with the content guys. It's always like, what would you love to do? And we'll try and get someone to pay for it. That's always the mindset I have. So that was the kind of prime example of that kind of scenario. And again, it became the kind of blueprint maybe around other preseason games that we would have, whereby actually we can look at this as more of a D2C proposition. And that gives us the foundation for all of the additional assets that you can create. And as a sponsor, how you can kind of bring them in is you almost say that if you pay for all the shoulder stuff, we'll almost give you the main asset as an add-on because we're going to drive loads of value for you in those other spaces.
Yeah, no, that inspires me so much. I love ideas like that. As soon as you start to think outside the box, there's so much potential in where you can grow. But you've got me caught up on broadcast rights now. Do you think this space has more to innovate in? Like, I'm looking at the Premier League and what they've done as an overall product. Could they go down the route of becoming their own broadcast partner where they broadcast the games through, like I see kind of almost like the NBA League Pass or what some of the other leagues have done where they've kind of just become their own broadcaster, maybe with a partner in play to kind of back them up. But I'm curious if there's another approach there that could be done.
The challenge is the teams love having a guaranteed check at the start of the season, and a big one at that. And so I know that the Premier League are trialing a D2C proposition in certain markets at the moment. And I think you're right. I think it's going to be additive to a traditional broadcast model in the short term anyway. But again, I would look at the short form content opportunities or the additional content opportunities on top of the kind of purist live proposition as the ways to open up that new door into revenue, whether it is companion kind of live streaming products, whether it is clips and what you can do around that space. I remember being at a conference. It was around women's football. At the time, the Women's Super League had a new broadcast partner, and they were talking about creating a digital first strategy. And I kind of posed the question of almost in that scenario, if ultimately you're broadcasting the games because you want to build awareness, you want to build engagement to the point where you're creating new fans that may buy a jersey, buy a ticket to a game, whatever else. Does it matter if they're watching a full game or if they're watching it through 30-second, 60-second clips, a 7-minute highlight show, whatever? And do you put the focus into that space? Now, it was too early for most people in a kind of digital journey to kind of look into that kind of space. But the question still remains is that, what is a view, and does it matter where it is or how it is? It's almost the NBA model where their broadcast viewership is going down, the rights value is going up because it's all the other stuff that goes into the rights proposition that's really driving the value. So I'd look at that kind of model somewhat for the Premier League, but I'm really interested in actually the crossover with the creator space at the moment and what's going on with that, and looking at ultimately how, whether it's broadcasters, whether it's teams, how can you create a two-way conversation with your audience in real time as the games are going on, and whether that be through personalized content. So do you want it in a different language? Do you want it in a different style of a play-by-play and conversation? Or do you want it in a an augmented reality format and a stats and a betting or whatever? I think that level of innovation is very coming soon, very down the pipe. Those areas, I think, are the areas that really excite me.
Yeah, I think like I think of TikTok did one with Messi during one of his Inter Miami games where the live stream was just of him
Sure.
on TikTok. And I remember I watched it just because of like, oh, like I'm really not watching anyone else on the field in an Inter Miami game anyways. So if I can just watch him, like that's interesting. And I think there's also plays with like Baller League, Kings League. You're starting to see where you can watch the actual broadcast on, I think Baller League in the UK is now on Sky Sports.
Yeah.
But then you can watch your favorite streamer also react and you can kind of interact with him at the same time. And like I think it adds that kind of third component that you're talking about where you can almost talk back and forth while watching, which is fascinating.
I think there's an interesting conversation around the role of vertical video within the sports. And so the reason why the NBA has so much success is because actually as a sport and as the action progresses, you can view it quite well because it's ultimately a one-on-one sport in most aspects. Whereas with soccer or football, you need the breadth of field of vision around a widescreen format. But the Baller League and those things that are slightly more akin to a five-a-side, or at least that kind of NBA style where it is more of a one-on-one game, that works a lot more in the social vertical clip space.
Yeah, there's so many opportunities to go about that. Before we get into kind of the trends and more of the topics we're discussing now, the one last thing I wanted to touch on with the city group, I guess you could say as a whole, when did the actual, I can't remember now the actual dates of when it kind of became a multi-club ownership, but was there ties or ways that affected your work on the commercial side? Because obviously on the sporting side, it's obvious the players are kind of loaned back and forth to each other. There's ways to kind of maneuver things in that. But I'm curious on the commercial side how that looked.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, when I joined the club or the organisation, they had at that point 4 teams part of the network. So Manchester, New York had launched, Melbourne had rebranded as Melbourne City, and Yokohama was there as where they were a minority investor as part of their Nissan partnership. And so, yeah, absolutely. The way that it operated actually is that technically I was employed by this kind of overarching parent group called City Football Marketing. So we were a resource for the entire group. The reality was 80-90% of the time you're working on Manchester City, both realistically from a kind of geography and location point of view, but also the nature of the business and how important the revenues were to that size. But no, there were absolutely some group-wide aspects, both kind of on a broad spectrum around, again, processes and tools and looking at how we structured partnerships and how we looked at trends and what we kind of deemed as best practice. But no, we would also be brought into specific projects around the teams and spent some time in New York and spent some time in the Far East thankfully City had a number of different offices around the world, some time in China. And the nature of that business, I think what is really interesting is that you are working on an international, global, but also local point of view, both in the sense that you're working on Manchester City on a global spectrum, but then looking at on a global spectrum, New York maybe locally and Melbourne locally as well, and the kind of differing dynamics around the commercial and the marketing landscape in those different regions. So it was a really fascinating kind of education into the wider kind of global sports marketing space.
Perfect. No, I love it. I think that gives us a good overview on the city side of things. This next section, which I think we kind of already have gotten into, is the overall trend talk. What's happening today and kind of getting more insights on that side of things. We've given some detail on some of the key partnerships or trends and where things are going. I want to get an overview from your side of maybe the organizations, the leagues, the clubs that are really innovating in this space now. We've already spoken. I think Man City's still doing a fantastic job to this day. But if we go even outside of football or traditional football, so we spoke about Kings League, Baller League, but I think also properties like Live Golf. I think the women's space is really interesting now with like WNBA. I think they have, is it Rivals League, which is the new women's basketball league as well. Like so many of these different tie-ins. From your perspective, who's killing it now?
Yeah, so as I said before, I'm very interested in the kind of creator space and how that is merging with the professional environment. I think what you're finding still, though, is that in a lot of cases where you're finding traditional rights holders are trying to embrace creators, they're still kind of doing it on their terms. So if you look at what happened recently in golf with the Players' Championship, instead of running their traditional pro-am the day before, they ran a creator tournament, but it was still kind of in a traditional format. And an interesting post that I saw recently on LinkedIn by Ed from Display, who's a great YouTube and data proposition, was that a load of rights holders are still producing content and putting it on YouTube rather than creating content for YouTube. And so I think what you're finding is that, and again, there's a similar story to an extent around the Baller League, whereby, yes, they're simulcasting on YouTube, but also on Sky. But I wonder more the other way around. Actually, the more interesting aspect of that is around the integration with other creators, the watch-alongs, the clips, how they're going to take that content and really push it out into the social space, how they're amending their game to feel more like the kind of digital landscape. So the extra little rules they throw in at the back end of each half to keep the interest up, and those are the kind of clippable bits, really. It's almost like they play 19 minutes a half so that they can create the 1 minute that people actually really want to see at the end of each half. So those things I think are quite interesting. I'm also really fascinated by looking at athlete media and how those guys are transitioning into their new life spans, if you like. And obviously in the US, the trailblazers are people like Pat McAfee, the Kelces, those guys. Over here, we're having a similar space, but it still feels a bit more traditional in that you're finding players, either recent or ex-players, are moving more into the traditional broadcaster talking head space and then leveraging that into maybe their own creator environment. There's only really a handful that are going the other way. And I would direct people to Ben Foster, who, if you may be familiar with, who was part of the Welcome to Wrexham documentary in Series 2, former England goalkeeper, Manchester United. He played in the Premier League for Watford as well. But what he did towards the end of his career was realise that actually he could create a YouTube channel and give a really unique perspective whilst he was still playing. Kind of illegally put a GoPro in a goal whilst the games were going on, which he didn't have the rights to, but it gave people a really unique insight into what actually is going on within the field. And he's now doing a whole host of content ventures, podcasts, in a variety of spaces off the back of that. And that's almost leading him into the more traditional space off the back of his own social profile. So I'm really interested in those kind of dynamics and seeing where that goes and where traditional rights holders and traditional broadcasters can kind of embrace those people that have unique insights, unique audiences, and marry it up with their more traditional way of working.
Yeah, I love Ben. Ben to me was when you say trailblazer, like the amount of stick that he used to get from media, from fans with a GoPro in the goal. But I think it was at the perfect time where he was nearing the end of his career, so he didn't have much to prove still. He had played for Man United. He had been a part of the national team and so on, so he kind of already had that behind him and then transitioned out of it beautifully. I think I think that wouldn't have happened without him being basically a content creator. He became a content creator. Wrexham was picking up on that, and it was kind of the perfect play of, hey, he's a really good goalie, but he also happens to bring a ton of views. Let's put the two together, put him in the TV show, and let it take off.
But the way his time at Wrexham went almost felt scripted. It was so unbelievable how he ended up saving a penalty in their biggest game of the season in the 95th minute to effectively get them promoted. It was just a crazy 8-10 week ride that he had there with the club. But no, him and his guys are really kind of smashing it.
Do you think the UK's perspective, like I had a discussion not too long ago with someone else on the podcast on kind of this topic of the UK still has so much pressure towards players on just performing on the field. Like I'm looking at even this newer generation of kind of the Snapchat boys and a lot of these players that are kind of innovating in the way they approach social media. And you're seeing more locker room conversations and dances and kind of behind the scenes. And I think that's great because you're starting to see, okay, these guys have a real personality. They're not just this player that moves around on a field and you can celebrate their goals, but they actually have a life beyond the game. But there's still the pressure. I would say it's mainly in the UK and Europe as a whole, where in the US, it's like you've mentioned with the Kelce boys, they can go out and have do a podcast together and have a bad game, and they'll get stick for it, but it's nowhere near as bad as what would happen in the UK. So I'm curious, like, do you see a revolution where this can start to change?
So part of it is that the UK audiences just aren't used to seeing this, because the clubs, and in particular their comms departments, would be so protective of anything getting out that wasn't, sanitized and positive. So I think the fact that again, PR and comms guys are starting to be a bit more aware of the wider world, and that these guys have personalities, and and there's benefit to everybody in getting them out there. That's starting to be said, but yeah, we are a part of the challenge with the UK is that the fan bases are so tribalistic that nothing can kind of denigrate the team. Nothing can besmirch the badge, if you like. And so it's a challenge really that people need to get out their own way and ultimately enjoy these people for what they are. And I think ultimately now what you're finding is that because the younger sports people are growing up as real digital and social natives, they're not making the kinds of mistakes that maybe were made by sports people 5-10 years ago in those kind of environments. And ultimately, kind of tying back into the previous conversations, I think that until we get the next generation of leaders at the very top of the sports that are in that digital native space, we still, particularly here in the UK, are probably going to be 5-10 years behind North America in our understanding and adoption of these digital practices.
Yeah, like I was looking at the NFL now has cameras in the general manager's office, and like his family's in there talking about the draft. Like that is crazy to me that you would allow such access. But I think, like you say, once that sort of generation of leaders on like the NFL side moves over to the UK, I think you'll start to allow access, because really all you have is maybe all or nothing is the most. But what was interesting is, say one of the first kind of innovators in that space was Sunderland with their series on Netflix.
Yeah.
But it backfired because people were almost like, it was almost a hate watch. People were just enjoying watching them lose. Where I think Wrexham's been the first one to flip that and win while producing a show and having the content as a part of it, which I think will maybe lead this next generation into, okay, our team can do well and we can make content at the same time, and those help even more.
So as far as I'm aware, the Sunderland one was created by an outside company. So even though they had their owners were Sunderland fans, that's why they picked the club, but they had the club themselves didn't have much say in what was going on. I think actually before Wrexham, and again, ties back to the original conversation, the innovators in this space actually were City. So City did the first football all or nothing. And what that did was it normalized having content people around the players on a day-to-day basis. And so as a result, City now have 3 full-time producers, videographers that are effectively part of the first team squad. And because they saw from year one, it helps that you've got Amazon giving credibility to it that basically allowed the commercial people to say to the football people, we're doing this. Whereas in a lot of other places, the football people have too much power to say no to the commercial people. Because that went so well from a production point of view, and obviously the fact is they were everywhere, but it didn't impact on team performance. That then has opened the door to a lot of other teams doing similar things where they are getting guys in and getting access for fans that was never done before. And it's the same, again, it's nothing that NFL films haven't done for 30 years. Yeah. But it was new here because if the coach said no, that was it. Whereas here, if the coach says no, the CEO says, but actually, this is, this could buy you a new left back if we do well. This paints us as a team whereby other players may see this and think, I want to go and play there. I want to work for this guy. They've got a great environment and culture. And it's a big marketing tool from a fan, but also from a playing point of view as well. So, again, hat tip to City. I have no vested interest in them, I must say. But hat tip to them for...
You still got some stock in them.
No, but they were the first ones to really do that. Yeah. And now they have built out City Studios, which is, 100-odd people. But more importantly, they have built that credibility inside the practice facility that they're not seen as a nuisance. They're seen as an additive department to the football side. And that's the biggest hurdle to try and overcome.
I'm reading the Sir Alex Ferguson, one of his leadership books right now, and I think he basically ran Manchester United as the manager, which is
Absolutely.
so not the case today. And I think he would be totally against this idea because he hated having anyone involved or anything. But I think that's the way the sporting side has changed for sure, where you used to have a club hire a manager and he would kind of manage and understand almost the entirety of he's almost the CEO of
Absolutely.
the club in a sense, especially in those days. Now you're having a club where they have a sporting director, they have a CEO, they kind of set the tone of, okay, this is what we want. Let's bring in a manager that applies to that. And it's kind of flipped completely differently. So I think that's where what you're mentioning there.
Yeah, the closest thing you guys probably had is college coaches in how they run that entire program. That's what it was like over here until probably the last 10 years. And even now, I'd still say in certain Premier League teams, that's still the case, that as you move down the league and, from the championship below, you're still getting, in most cases, the head coach or the manager is the number one guy, really, that makes all decisions, that sets the culture for the entire environment. But the bigger teams are trying to put a more competitive structure out there that negates the value to an extent of the coach, to the point where if they had to change it, you don't have to rework the entire organization anymore. You can just put a new coach in, but still continue, hopefully, in the right direction.
As we wrap up here, I had a little bit of an idea yesterday when I was writing up the questions, getting everything organized. I wanted to do like a bit of a case study. So give you an under the radar team, maybe a lower league team, and we kind of strategize a way through where from day one, what would you kind of do to revamp the commercial side and make them not necessarily something like Wrexham, but I think follow some of the approaches of just modernizing what they do commercially now and kind of flip it. But first, I want you to introduce First 5 Yards. I think let's give your side a shout out and kind of just share with the audience what is First 5 Yards, what is your kind of focus and goal, and then we'll get into the case study side of things.
Sure. So when I left City at the start of 2020, the role and remit that I had was quite unique. And I looked around the rest of the marketplace, and that job just didn't seem to exist anywhere else, this notion of driving monetization through digital platforms. So I set up on my own as a one-man band consultant under that moniker of First 5 Yards, and have worked with a number of clubs and different sports organizations, as well as sports tech companies, on the notion of how can we maximize the kind of digital platforms and audiences that sports organizations have to drive more revenue opportunities, be that through what I class as the kind of 3 pillars of monetization, be it simply first, second, and third party. So first party is kind of user payment or getting an organization to pay for your content en masse. Second party is brand partnerships, and third party to an extent is advertising. But, there's a lot more that goes into the intricacies of it. But ultimately, it's those 3 key drivers. And in the initial stages, it's really looking at how an organization can maximize their existing assets, access, and resources to find new revenue streams. So those are the areas that I've been working in for the last few years, and looking at, new products, new tech, new trends that come in to help that process. And I think for me, an interesting team to look at right now is Birmingham City. So they have just won promotion from League One up to the Championship, which is the league below the Premier League. They are co-owned by Tom Brady, and they're owned by a US investment fund. And so whilst there will be a lot of comparisons to Wrexham and the story and the way that they operate, I think Birmingham will operate in a different manner, but have huge opportunities. First of all, they're in a huge city. They're in the second or third biggest city in the UK. They have a history of success, much more recent than Wrexham have. And obviously starting from a slightly higher floor than Wrexham were. But also they have, in Tom Brady in particular, they have a sports opinion they can kind of trust and understand inside the field, in the same way that JJ Watt is advising and helping Burnley. Again, there's some very interesting things to look at in those spaces and see where they go. So I know that there are some smart people involved, a lot of experienced people involved on the back end at Birmingham. Now that they have gone up, I'm sure they will be investing in really looking to build out a kind of best-in-class proposition. And it would be interesting to see what that looks like, because they have this ability to, again, go local and global, but on a slightly different level to Wrexham, because of the starting point that they're in, the UK's second city.
I have 2 points from that. First 5 yards. What's the name behind? Like, what's the idea behind it?
So I played for many years. Played football, and I was never blessed with a huge amount of mobility and pace. And a similar player, Teddy Sheringham, who was an attacker in the 90s and 2000s, again wasn't the fastest player, but he always used to say that the first 5 yards are in your head, and so knowing where to go and when to go and how to go would always put you in the right place before everyone else. So I like to kind of think that I played the game in the same kind of way as a defender, but took that to heart as kind of that's my strategic outlook into things. It's not about how things have always been done. It's more about how can we get to the place in a quick manner. So that's kind of where that name came up, first of all.
Yeah, no, I love it. And then on the Birmingham side, what came to mind when you mentioned Tom Brady, obviously being one of the GOATs, I guess you would consider them the greatest of all time. I think Cristiano Ronaldo being another one, and an interesting move with the movie studio that he's now started. Do you think first of all, I want to get your thoughts on that, because I'm just constantly, I think we could go all day here, just constantly linking idea to idea. But from Ronaldo's side with the movie studio, Tom Brady, could you see something coming to play? I'm curious some of the innovations that you could see, like an American like Tom Brady with no connection to this type of football, soccer. How do you see him kind of coming to play in that?
I think in both cases, it's a combination of audience and then insight into the particular industry. So the Ronaldo thing, you only got to look at his YouTube numbers to see that there is a rabid audience that he has that will look at any content that he's connected with, however good or bad the quality is. You can argue on that. So it makes sense for a content partner to partner with him to create content in some way, shape, or form. Now, what that looks like, who knows? I was surprised to see, bearing in mind the nature of what Marv Films put out there is not overly similar to maybe Cristiano's YouTube channel, but it's interesting just to look at. Ultimately, it's about leveraging audiences to drive, commercial revenue. So it makes sense to me in that sense that you, as a content output, would want to partner with someone in that space. And again, it depends on what they're looking to do. Are they looking at sports related content? Are they looking at storytelling? Are they looking at how they can leverage his network of contacts as well? And that's similar, I think, to again the Tom Brady scenario with Birmingham. It's around he has an audience that's going to help them, build interest in an international market. But there's also insight he can provide into leadership, into sports performance. Whether he's going to get them all on the TB12 diet or not, I don't know. But you will see if they're all doing weird plyometrics before the game. But again, it's the same thing. It's how can you leverage your strengths and partner with someone that maybe has different strengths to create a super product. And that's ultimately what they're all trying to do.
Yeah, I think the other one that comes to mind is Michael B. Jordan with Bournemouth. I think he's already starting to integrate some of his films, some of the projects that he's working on with the team. And you're starting to see this American connection build where someone like Wrexham having a preseason tour in the States maybe 5-10 years ago would have been absurd and no one would have showed up. But now you're selling out MLS stadiums. You're even selling out college stadiums in some of the bigger ones. So I think that all kind of comes into play.
I think what they're realizing, though, it's the same model that the guys doing Prime Hydration have figured out, is that actually, if you're leveraging your audience and your own notoriety, your marketing budget is practically zero as a result. So you can put all of that into activation, into quality, rather than paid media, and that's going to do all the legwork. So that's why you you want an investor of that kind of nature, because they're almost getting the investment for free, because you can almost give them the investment because the benefits you're going to get on the back end are going to be huge.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great way. Should we wrap things up with some quick fire questions here?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. The one skill you think everyone in the sports industry should develop?
I think the ability to capture your own content and edit it and produce it. I know there are more and more tools out there now that will make that easier and easier for you, but it's a great first foot in the door at any organization. Any major rights holder, any team is looking for more content producers. So in that kind of space, I think it's a great place to start.
Yeah, I think alongside that, just the personal brand, I think, is so important today. The next one here, one brand and one sports property that haven't collaborated yet, but you just feel like they just should be aligned.
I'm going to cheat and say one that has, but I literally saw this morning. I thought it was amazing. And I found out about the story of BYU. So the Jewish quarterback at BYU.
Oh, yeah.
Had signed an NIL deal with Manischewitz, who create Jewish kosher foods in a Mormon environment. I think is just amazing. So that was just the thing that blew me away. Having seen that was crazy.
The NIL space is honestly phenomenal. Like I think it's the first one. I'm trying to think of the guy's name. Mr. Aura, I think it was during the March Madness, was one of the sort of team managers,
yes.
like almost like a water boy,
yes.
was walking around with. He had $100,000 worth of deals in less than a week. And I think that space is so cool to see, because I think in a lot of mainstream sports, the idea of innovation, although people want to innovate, they're still not really pushing the standards of what can be done. And then you're seeing now with like something like NIL, because the space is just the Wild West at the moment, you're seeing all these crazy innovations happen. And it's from someone like me who's just a pure fan of this, I love seeing it.
Absolutely.
The last one here, if you could sit down with one person, past or present, who would it be and why, for a meal and a chat?
Maybe controversial. I'd really like to sit down with Roger Goodell. I'm really fascinated by the nature of that role, being the head of the NFL, but you've actually got 32 or 31 and a half bosses, and everyone allegedly hates you, but they don't really, because all you're doing is driving success within that business. I'm fascinated by that constant kind of balance, and how much how he kind of continues to push through, and how they as an entity continue to innovate to a certain point and drive. Like they're still growing, and they're growing internationally, and that side of things. I think it's a fascinating story that he must have.
Yeah, he's almost comparable to like a politician. Like you have basically every fan in the NFL just hates you no matter what, even if they don't really know what you're doing and how you're driving. Then you're helping the owners by innovating the league, bringing it to new destinations, like record-breaking deals in terms of media rights and so on. But then you have, like you say, all these extreme personalities of the owners from each team. They're also your boss, but they're still voting you in, but you're still sort of hated. It's like this weird love-hate relationship.
He's basically a wrestling character. It's amazing how that all kind of works. He's basically, Vince McMahon, maybe without some of the legal issues.
Rob, I appreciate your time. Thanks again. If you have any last words, and then we can wrap things up.
No, thank you for having me again. Really appreciate and enjoyed the conversation. If anyone's interested in talking or following me, I'm on all the socials under First 5 Yards or at Rob Gevertz.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, we'll make sure to add them all down below in the description. Rob, thanks again, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.